I'm Joel McCower, executive editor of greenbiz.com. We're talking about what will it take to make aviation sustainable. Here with Chris Webb, head of carbon markets for the Nature Conservancy. So let's talk about aviation. What's the role of carbon offsets in making aviation sustainable?
Offsets within aviation have actually been around for a long while now. IATA has had a voluntary scheme that airlines could sign up to for over a decade to enable airlines to offer offsets to their consumers. And over time, we've seen more and more airlines actually use offsetting as a tool to help balance the emissions associated with some portion of their flights. That is the realm of sort of voluntary offsetting. There's also impending the CORSIA scheme, and that scheme requires the sector to a target of net zero growth from 2020. And it's expected that offsetting, particularly in the near term, which in this sector is probably somewhere between 5 and 15 to 20 years, that offsetting will be a key tool that the sector will rely on to deliver that net zero growth target.
Some airline executives are taking a wait-and-see approach when it comes to offsets. They're waiting to see what kinds of mandates, regulations, or other things come along, and also waiting to see what some of the leadership, what their peers are doing before they jump in. What would you like airline executives to know about offsets that they don't seem to quite get?
Consumers and customers are rapidly demanding more of companies by way of taking action to tackle climate change. And given the aviation sector's footprint right now, offsetting could be a really big part in their response to customers. So the first is, I think customers' requirements and demands of these companies are going to change very quickly. Second is that because of the upcoming CORSIA scheme, offsetting will be a part of how airlines tackle climate change. Our advice to companies, airlines included, is that this is coming. We think that those airlines that would succeed once the CORSIA scheme hits are those that have got in early and understood what it takes to generate high integrity, at scale offset projects, and have built the expertise and relationships and networks to do so.
How do we make sure that the trees that we're planting to offset carbon for aviation or anything else are going to do what we set them out to do?
In the last decade or so, we've learned a huge amount from trying different projects and different tools to help deal with that risk. And there are a number of things that projects do now to help manage that risk. One of those is at a project level, where understanding those risks and building that into the design of a program is much more sophisticated than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. The second is at a standard level. So when you have a number of projects that all follow the same standard, those standards now often use what's called a buffer mechanism. Essentially, it's a tool that sets aside a portion of the offsets for events that might result in those trees disappearing for one reason or another: fire, pest, other issues.
So how big of a role could offsets potentially play in neutralizing the environmental and climate impacts of aviation?
So offsetting has a large role to play, particularly in the near term. The CORSIA scheme I mentioned earlier has the bulk of those emissions reductions in the next decade or so coming from offsets. But ultimately over time, that will need to diminish. As we get to 2050, there is essentially a very, very small space for offsetting. Whilst in the near term, we see offsetting providing perhaps the majority of the emissions reductions required, in the long term, that will have to go to very close to zero. So we've seen huge growth in the voluntary carbon market and in carbon offsets writ large around the world in recent times. And I think that will continue in the coming future. I think there are a couple of trends that are worth picking out there. One is we do continue to see nature and nature-based offsets getting more and more important within the offsetting world, and I think that will continue. The other is that I think companies will start to see greater expectations around the role that offsetting plays in raising their ambition. They will be held to an even higher bar in the near future than perhaps they were previous years.
Chris Webb is head of carbon markets for the Nature Conservancy. Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you, Joel.